All right, welcome everyone. This is a brief video lecture on research and integrating outside sources for English 105 or 105I. Excuse me. These slides that you're seeing are in a PowerPoint presentation that I will share with all of you on our Sakai course site on the resources tab. Some of this stuff is material that we may have already discussed in class. Some is material that we will discuss further in class, but I've created this to be a helpful lecture that maybe provides a bit more info than would be just going through the PowerPoint on your own. All right, so first of all, we need to think about different types of sources: popular versus peer-reviewed or scholarly or academic, and then hybrid. So a popular source is going to be a source that is written by a non-expert author for a non-expert audience. So for instance, almost any .com website is probably written by a non-expert, and most websites are written for a non-expert audience because they are just publicly accessible, right? Almost any news article is going to be a popular source because the news is written or made or scripted for non-expert audiences. And journalists are experts in journalism. They're experts in conducting research, interviews, and quickly putting together and communicating a story and getting it out there quickly. They are not experts on what they're necessarily reporting on. They may know more than the average person, but they are not an expert. For instance, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal talking about the economy or the stock market is not an economist and is not an expert on the economy. That's why that reporter would bring in research and quotations and paraphrases from the experts, from the economists. So again, almost any news source is going to be a popular source as well. So when we say popular, we're not talking about something that is well known and everyone likes it. We mean popular as in the populace, common people, everyday people, non-experts, lay people, civil society. Again, whenever you're evaluating sources, it's important to take a moment and think, what kind of source is this? And use that to determine how credible and useful it's going to be. So think about, who is the author? What is their role in this? Are they an expert in the thing they're talking about? And then what is the intended audience, right? Who is this source intended for? As we've said before, whenever you're beginning a new writing project, think about the thing you're trying to create. Think about your rhetorical context or situation. Similarly, anytime you are looking at a new text or a new source, evaluate it in the same manner. Break it down. Think about the role of the author, the genre, the purpose, and the audience. Popular sources can still be useful. They can be useful for preliminary research, right? When you are just trying to figure out, you just need to learn a little bit more about a topic to help you choose a topic or narrow a topic, right? If you're brainstorming different topics and you're trying to determine which topic to choose, you may have to do a little preliminary research. You don't need to immediately go to the difficult scholarly sources yet. You just need to maybe do a little quick Google search and learn a bit more about your topic to help decide, is that something that you want to write about or research about? And sometimes you may just kind of test out an idea and say, okay, I need to make sure this actually works, right? I had a literary analysis paper I was writing. I had a theory. That theory would only work if the story was written before World War I. So I just had to do a little preliminary research on the story and double check, when exactly was it written, right? Do I remember that right? So preliminary research, popular sources can be very useful for preliminary research, or just getting an idea of what is the current conversation going on around this topic in terms of popular media, mainstream media. What are people saying, assuming, believing, misperceiving about it? Typically, though, they're not going to be sources you actually integrate into most of your research, unless your research topic happens to be about like mainstream perceptions or representations. So typically it's not something you'd include or cite in a paper, but it is useful for giving you that understanding of the common or popular discourse around a given topic. And again, just to introduce you, and that gives you enough information then to where your more thorough research moving forward is more guided and focused. So then we can think about, on the other end of the spectrum, academic or scholarly sources, also called peer-reviewed sources. And this gives you a link to a quick 3-minute video about how peer review works. A scholar will write a paper, they will submit it to a scholarly journal, And the editors of that scholarly journal, if they think it might be worth publishing, will send it out to other similar scholars in the field anonymously. And those scholars vet it. They read it through and critique it and either say, this is great, or more likely they'll say, this needs a lot more work. This is not worthy of publication. Or they may say, this needs some work and here's the flaws. Here's how it needs to be fixed. So anything that is an actual published as a scholarly article or any kind of academic peer-reviewed source, it has been reviewed by other peers, other experts. So it's not just one expert's work. It is their work, but it has already been reviewed or vetted by other scholars. So it's highly credible and trustworthy. That doesn't mean it's perfect. There can be flaws, but at the very least, it is reliable in a scholarly sense. That doesn't mean all scholars agree with every single point made, but the scholarship itself is valid. So again, these are written by experts for other experts in the field. Most ordinary people don't read a bunch of scholarly material, right? This is how scholarly discourse works. Within different discourse communities of literary scholars or scientists, this is how scholarly and academic information is produced and disseminated. It's the true source of scholarly discourse around a given topic. And then in between these two is a hybrid source, and it's called hybrid because it's kind of a combination of the two. It is written by experts, but for primarily a non-expert audience. So examples would include governmental or organizational websites, articles, agencies. So for instance, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, their materials are aimed at non-expert audiences, right? They are creating websites and materials and guidelines for everyday people to understand. They're not exactly creating new knowledge, right? They may do internal reports they don't share, but the stuff they share with us, they're reporting on the latest findings and knowledge, right? So it is written by experts, but for a non-expert audience. So that's where that hybrid kind of model comes in. Most of these, if it's a website, it's probably going to be either a .gov, maybe a .org. Typically a .com, a .net, those are going to be popular sources, not very reliable. Some .orgs might not be very reliable. All right, but those are basically the three types of sources. So for any source you're evaluating, think about what type of source is this? I want to briefly take a moment to also talk about how to cite images. It's pretty straightforward in terms of citing texts, right? But when we start thinking about an image, a photograph, a painting, etc., a lot of people get confused. When you're looking at an image, you have to think about the author of the source in the author of the actual image, right? So a lot of times you may go to some online article and there's a photograph. People make the mistake of thinking, oh, the author of the article is the author of the photograph. No, probably not. Just because an image appears on a website doesn't mean the person who created that website or online article took that photograph. In fact, most of the time it's not, right? So the author of the source in which that image appears isn't necessarily the author of the image. And a lot of people online are very irresponsible about posting and using images without giving due credit. What you should do, a responsible author should clearly indicate where that photo came from, right? Whether it's a caption underneath the photo that lists the photo credit or the source, or at least gives a hyperlink to where that photo can be found on an online database. Many images people put online into online databases, and you can go there and you can actually get it, and it's available for basically Creative Commons use, free and fair reuse. But you should at least then provide that, right? I found this through Google Images, Creative Commons, free and fair reuse. Again, just because you found an image under Google Images doesn't mean it's available that way. So you should look for a caption or any kind of information that the author of that source has ideally provided for you. You should also click on the image or right click and then select View Image. And that'll open up a new tab or window where you're just looking at the image. That should be the URL you use for that image. If you gave that URL to someone, it would take them directly to a tab or window that just has that image. Again, like any other text, go to the original source of this piece of media, try to hunt it down, find the original author, publisher, the usage rights, etc. Think of it in this way. If you were reading a source by Smith and Smith quotes another scholar named Johnson, and you use the Johnson quote, you wouldn't cite Smith, right? You would give credit to Johnson because Johnson's the person who said it. If Smith writes an article and includes a photo by Johnson, it's the same thing. You need to cite the original author or creator. Again, your citations for an image will depend on whether or not this image has been published for free and fair reuse or under a Creative Commons license, or whether you need to actually hunt down the author and give specific credit to that person. Your full bibliographic citation might need to include this image's type of media. It depends on the citation format you're working on, but a lot of them, somewhere in the bibliographic citation, you need a very brief description, such as, let's think if it was a painting, it would be, I don't know, watercolor on canvas. That's it. Or digital photograph. Or especially if you look up images in a database, you might be looking at online, you're looking at a photograph of the actual artwork, which is a sculpture. Right? What you're using in your source is not an actual sculpture. You're using a digital photograph of a sculpture. So that would be the description. So remember too, if you're looking at an image of another object, it's not the same as looking at the object, right? All right. And again, I have provided a more thorough document titled How to Cite Images, Visuals, and Data Visualizations, etc. at this location, Sakai Resources, Helpful Handouts and Resources. It walks you through how to cite your images, whether or not it's available for free or fair reuse, how you need to cite it in various disciplines. It gives more detail. And again, to clarify, when I say data visualizations, I mean things like graphs, charts, figures, infographics, right? The way we take data and turn it into some kind of image. Things that you could create yourself, things that might appear in an existing article. Now I want to switch gears and think about two different types of research and sources, primary versus secondary research. Primary research is when you are conducting your own study or investigation. So an example of primary research would be if you conduct an experiment, or if you go out and do a survey or poll a population, if you go out and you conduct observations of a certain population or interviews, or if you are interpreting a text on your own. So let's say you are just interpreting a short story on your own and there's no outside research. Technically, that's kind of primary research. Your primary research is your own unique interpretation of one given text. Now, in contrast to that, secondary research is probably what you're more familiar with. Secondary research is studying what others have said or done, often looking at their primary research. So secondary research, you learn what others have said or done. So for instance, if some other scientist does an experiment, then for that scientist, that is his or her primary research, right? That person did the experiment and they published an article about it. You are looking at that article. It's not your experiment. It's not your research. It's secondary research. You're looking at sources on medical conditions or nutritional values or someone else's experiment. You're looking at demographic information on the population that you're polling or the topic of the poll. You're looking at background information on the subcultures that you're observing or interviewing. Or again, if you were interpreting a short story, you might do secondary research to look up the information about the author's biography or the historical events that took place when the author was composing or publishing that story. Tied to primary and secondary research is primary and secondary sources. Primary sources, the material you are directly interpreting and discussing. So if you did an experiment, that's primary research. So your primary source would be your experimental data, right? The actual notes of the results from your experiment, or the data from your poll or survey, or the notes you took when you were doing observations, or the transcripts and notes from your interviews. Or the story, the poem, or some other text that you're actually interpreting, right? The primary thing that you're interpreting. In contrast to that, what many of you are probably more familiar with, again, are secondary sources. And this is the studies or writings of other scholars, what other people have done or said. Again, it's often the product of their own primary research. So like I said, if some other scientist did an experiment, that's their primary research. And they take their experimental data and they turn that into a scholarly article. For you to look at that study of someone else's experiment, for you, that's a secondary source. Or if someone else did a poll or a study or an observation or an interview, or if other scholars have interpreted a text, or other scholars have written biographies of the author or historical information. So again, most of what you're going to do is secondary research. The only time it's primary research is when you are actually going out doing the study, right? You are getting your hands dirty, conducting an experiment, an observation, etc. But it's an important thing this is important language just to know. Sometimes you're going to just do one or the other. It depends on, again, your rhetorical context. It depends on the assignment. If you were told just to write a research paper and you're told you're just combining information from other people, then that's all secondary research. That's all secondary sources, right? But you might be told, I want you to interpret this poem. I don't want you looking at any other sources. Just look at this poem and what do you think it means just based on the text of the poem? Then that is purely primary research. It's just you interpreting a poem on your own. Oftentimes, though, especially as your work gets more advanced and complex, and especially out in the real world, usually you're doing a combination of both, right? You will conduct some kind of primary, you'll have a topic, you'll do some secondary research to help inform you and guide your work moving forward and guide your decisions as you do primary research. Again, scientists don't just go out and do a random experiment. They do an experiment based on existing secondary research, right? What other people have said and done. So they use that secondary research to guide the design of their own experiment. So they do some primary research, and then they may end up doing some more secondary research as well. So a lab report, right, from just your own experiment, or a description of an ethnographic description of a population you're observing, or just a thorough literary analysis. These are forms of primary research, but secondary sources, as I've said, can help inform your decisions. They can guide your decisions or your methods. They can provide useful background context and information. They can justify your decisions, especially in terms of research methods, right? You may say, well, I designed my experiment because this other source, these other scholars said X, Y, and Z, right? So that's your way of justifying your decision. And just they can offer support for your own arguments or interpretations. They can do all of these things for your primary research. So you conduct primary research, and the secondary research kind of adds strength to it, right? It backs it up. It makes it more credible, more convincing, more effective. So with primary sources, again, this is the text or material being interpreted or discussed. Typically, it's just going to kind of involve your own notes, so you don't have to cite it in your paper, because we know it's coming from your own interpretation or your own experiment. If for some reason it's a text or comes from someone else, you do have to cite it. So for instance, if you are interpreting one text, you still need to cite that text, right? But if it's just notes from your own experiment, like, we know that's coming from you. In terms of secondary sources, they're always coming from someone else, so they always must be cited somehow to give credit to that person and to contribute to the scholarly discourse. Secondary sources typically have two functions, and this is, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but for the most part, they will provide context or background information, and or they can provide support, evidence for your claims, or justification for your decisions. Again, so backing up a claim that you're making, justifying a decision in your methods or how you interpret something, but also just, if you're writing a paper about an experiment on a particular disease, you should probably do some background research on the disease and provide that information to your reader, right? To provide background information or context, historical information, etc. And secondary sources can do both of these at the same time or in the same paper. But typically, they're going to do one of these or both. This is how they function. So they can provide, as I said, background information or context. So again, nutritional information or symptoms of a disease. These are just examples. Discussions of the population you're studying or the demographics, biography of an author, historical events of the period surrounding the text or whatever it is that you're interpreting. Again, these are just a few examples. They provide support, evidence for your claims, justification for your decisions. So justify your study design, or just why the study is important. Why is the topic important? Why is your decision important? Think about in the conclusion when you have to provide larger implications. They can support certain assumptions you had, what others have said about this subculture, right? You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to prove everything there is to know. You can say, well, it's been well accepted and well documented that X, Y, and Z is true, and cite your sources. Okay, based on that, I'm going to build off of that and actually say something new now. So what have other scholars said or not said about this work? Again, use other studies to back up, support, or provide evidence for your claims. I'll take a moment and remind you, college level writing is not just about having a thesis and making an argument. College level writing is about entering the scholarly discourse, which means you are always responding to what others have said. You are either building off of what they've said or arguing against it or adjusting or tweaking what they've said, right? And this is one way. Secondary sources are useful to say, here's what other people have said, and then here's how I'm responding. So that provides context for your own work. Refer to multiple sources to verify information. So don't just trust a single source's opinion. Again, everyone's human, everyone's limited, everyone has a bit of bias, no one's perfect. They may not be intentionally incorrect, but you need to verify your information you're getting. And remember that there are many ways to interpret data, many ways to interpret qualitative and quantitative data. So just because it's a statistic and technically true doesn't necessarily mean it's being interpreted or represented accurately. So in terms of using outside sources, again, if the information or idea isn't yours, always cite it. When in doubt, cite the source. Better to cite something that you didn't really need to, right? Better to err on the side of caution. Do not plagiarize, right? Plagiarizing is academic intellectual theft or dishonesty. Again, I've got a link here to the UNC Library's Guide on Plagiarism. It's also a violation of the UNC Honor Code, and it really does yourself a disservice as well. This infograph is available on Sakai. I've posted it in a few different places, but it's really useful to kind of break down, plagiarism is not necessarily binary, right? There is accidental plagiarism out of just carelessness or just a simple honest mistake, all the way to really stealing someone's identity or someone's work. But it's all plagiarism, right? So it's easy to accidentally plagiarize, but you still plagiarized, which means you still broke the honor code. And you still just violated someone else's and your own academic and intellectual integrity. So as we think about how to use outside sources, there's really three ways. You can summarize to condense and sum up kind of the text as a whole. Paraphrase, you can condense, sum up, and restate someone else's ideas from a section of the text, right? So you wouldn't paraphrase the entire text probably, but you may take a large section of the text and sum it up. Typically, paraphrasing is a way to, take several pages and sum it up in a few sentences or a paragraph, right? The key is that you're restating in your own words and structure. So here's a common error people make with paraphrasing. They take the original line, the original words of the author, and all they do is they swap out some synonyms. Let's say he said this is significant, I'll say major. He said this is problem, I'll say challenge. That is not adequate paraphrasing because you're still using sentence structure. A better way to paraphrase is to look at a large section of text, take a break, step away from it for a while, and then come back to your desk. Don't look at the text, just open up a blank Word document and see if you can put it into your own words. And it's okay if the first version of that is pretty ugly and simple, right? Typically, when you paraphrase, your paraphrase is going to be shorter than the material you are paraphrasing. And paraphrasing is a skill that you really need to use because you're going to be using it an awful lot. It's one of the most common ways you're actually going to be integrating outside sources. And then finally, you're all probably familiar with quoting to directly restate the words of someone else. All three of these require some form of citation, either parenthetically or in the text. Typically with a summary, you're not going to need an in-text citation. You'll just mention the author's name within your actual writing. But paraphrases and quotes, you need to have the author's name and page numbers or paragraph numbers somehow noted. And we'll go over this in more detail in a moment. So summarizing, here's a couple examples. Smith's 2015 study supports the notion that the culture created by the gold mine companies in South Africa worsens the condition of tuberculosis among its miners and the larger community. So that is a summary of an entire scholarly article, right? It's basically taking the entire content of the article and saying, overall, here's what the article does. And notice real quick, we have the last name of the author and we have the year. So we don't really need an in-text citation because this is everything we need. If I'm a reader, I know to go down to your bibliography and find Smith. Here's another. In Mark Twain's novel, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, a 19th century factory worker wakes up in 6th century Britain. He introduces a variety of industrial technologies that causes chaos, war, and death among the people. This novel is ultimately a condemnation of notions of modern industrial progress. Okay, so we've taken a novel and we've quickly summarized it, right? It's a big oversimplification. We've taken several hundred pages and we've summarized the plot, but that is a vital skill to have, to be able to take something and just sum it up in a sentence or two. And again, we know the author of the text. So if I'm reading this, presumably the rest of this paper is going to use quotes from the text. I know to go to the bibliography and find Twain. Oops. So again, cited within the text, but these should also appear in the works cited, right? And presumably you're going to continue to paraphrase and quote from these two sources in your paper, right? Or I mean, from each of these sources in your two different hypothetical papers, right? Paraphrasing, again, restating something in your own words and structure, someone else's ideas. So you're kind of summarizing a section of the text. You can paraphrase a specific passage or several pages, pull out the info that you need, right? So there may be 3 pages of useful information, but within those 3 pages, like, maybe a third of it isn't stuff you care about. Okay, so just sum up the material that you need, right? There's a lot of important stuff here. I'm going to sum up the points, right? So you don't have to take those 3 pages and paraphrase and cover every single point that's covered in those pages, right? Again, use your own words, use your own structure. Do not simply replace words with synonyms. That is still plagiarism. Cited within the text or parenthetically, and include page numbers, or for an online text, include paragraph numbers. That way, as a reader, if I wanted to find where you pulled that material, I could find that source, open it up, and go to that section. And again, it also appears in your works cited, your bibliography, etc. And then quoting, to directly restate the words of someone else. There's really only a couple times you should ever quote. So far, you're probably used to quoting a lot more than you really should. And that's why you're actually going to have to pull back on that instinct, quote less, and paraphrase more. Again, it depends on the assignment, the genre, the field, the discipline. But in general, I think that's a safe bet to say that you probably need to quote less than you think you should and provide more paraphrasing. You should quote simply when you can't say it better. Sometimes just someone in a source has just explained a problem better than you ever could. And no matter how hard you try to paraphrase that 1 or 2 sentences, you just can't. So you just have to quote it. It's the most efficient way to communicate it. Or you quote when you need to analyze their specific language or word choice. So for instance, you might quote, if you're studying a literary text, right? You're analyzing the literature, the word choice, the diction, the rhythm. It would be appropriate to provide the quote so the reader can see the quote and understand what you're commenting on, right? Because you are specifically looking at the language, the word choice, other literary elements. If you're doing a rhetorical or literary analysis, it makes sense to quote. If you are just pulling in outside sources to provide background information, you don't need to quote. It doesn't matter how eloquent or not that other scholar was when they talked about Hemingway's biography or the events of World War I. Just restate it, paraphrase it, shorten it, put it in your own words. So only quote when you simply can't say it better, or when you really need to dig into the specific language or word choice. If you're doing an ethnographic description or an interview, you may bring in outside quotes, right? Sometimes, occasionally, quotes can also be used to provide pathos, to get people to have kind of a sympathetic or emotional reaction, or sometimes you'll see it used as a hook. Opening with a quote is a common rhetorical device. I don't love it, but I suppose if it's a really powerful quote, that could be a way to grab people's attention. I would recommend not ending ever on a quotation. You want to end with your own words, not someone else's. So ending with someone else's words is kind of weak. But you could also use quotes sometimes as a hook, grab people's attention, or if it's a really powerful quote that could help create pathos or sympathy or an emotional reaction. Otherwise, for the most part, it's basically in these few instances. So you'll notice the examples on the screen. Cited within the text and or parenthetically, you include page numbers. So according to Smith, quote, tuberculosis among South African gold miners is a growing epidemic. Now, I will go ahead and say these are examples I just made up. These are actually not great examples of quotes. So here, I'm not exactly following my own rules about when you should quote, but I'm trying to just illustrate what the quote will look like, right? You have a opening quotation, you have a closing quotation, a space, and then your parenthetical citation. We've already said the author's name here, so we don't need to include it in the parenthetical citation. We will include a page number, however. And I just put these in APA just to give you another citation example. APA also requires the year. Again, it's going to vary a little bit based on your discipline and the citation format you're using, but there is going to be some kind of parenthetical citation. And notice the final punctuation that ends the sentence is after the in-text citation. Because if you put it before, that tells us, oh, the sentence is over, right? Here's another example. It seems evident that, quote, tuberculosis among South African gold miners is a growing epidemic, end quote. So notice here, we don't mention the author's name within the sentence, so we do have to include it in the in-text citation. If you included Smith in the in-text citation in the first one, it would just be redundant. And notice that the quote is kind of integrated into the sentence as like almost as part of the sentence. Either one is appropriate. They're both integrated into the sentence. One is just kind of like, according to Smith, or Smith says this. The other is you're just taking a phrase and kind of almost putting it as though it's your language. But again, the quotation marks and in-text citation make it clear to the reader that you are borrowing the words of someone else. And again, these will also be cited. These sources would also be cited in your bibliography at the end of your work. If you ever need to provide clarification within a quote, use these brackets. So for instance, let's say you have a quotation where it uses the word they, and you need to clarify who they is. Right after the word they, in brackets, you would put whoever they is, right? The affected population or people with cancer, whatever it is. If we see something in brackets within a quotation, it tells us this is material that was not in the quotation. It's being inserted for clarification purposes. Quotes should never stand alone, right? A quotation should never be its own sentence. You need to integrate them into your own sentence. So here's an example of what not to do. It is obvious that character X felt excited about this possibility, period, new sentence, quote, his eyes enlarged and his heart sped up. So we have two separate sentences here. The quote is its own sentence. Quotes, the emphasis should always be on your own ideas. Quotes should be used to serve your ideas. And that's not happening if a quotation is its own sentence. So here's a minor change. It is obvious that character X felt excited about this possibility, colon, and then the quotation. All we've changed the period to a colon, but that means that it is one whole sentence together. So that is more appropriate. Here's another option. It is obvious that character X felt excited about this possibility, as Smith states that, quote, his eyes enlarged and his heart sped up. So here's another version, right? We said the author's name within our sentence, so we don't need it in the in-text citation. This runs a little bit more smoothly. You'll notice in the second example where I use the colon here, if you want to have a sentence and then a pause and then the quotation, just use a colon. Otherwise, if you're going to say somebody said something, or you're going to take a little snippet of the quotation and work it into the sentence, it can just be kind of part of the sentence, and it runs a bit more smoothly. But the second and third examples you see here, either could work. A couple common errors in terms of style to avoid with quotations. Don't awkwardly talk about how a line or quote does something. Lines and quotes don't do something. The author does something. The text as a whole does something. So just show the reader. So here's a common mistake. Like character X, the artist singing this song seems afraid and fearful. The line, quote, I don't know what to do or where to go, end quote, best exemplifies this. That's awkward. That's like, it functions similarly to the book on the desk is very heavy, right? The book on the desk, the phrase on the desk is describing adverbially the book, right? The line, I don't know what to do or where to go, best exemplifies this. So you're like turning this line into an object. It's just awkward. You don't want to quote like in the middle, like serving as the subject of the sentence. So here's a better way to do this. Like character X, the artist singing the song seems afraid and fearful, stating that he doesn't, quote, know what to do or where to go. So again, it runs more smoothly. You don't have to say the line XYZ shows us something. Instead, just say, the artist states this, the narrator states blah, 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 right? And that the fact that the narrator says this shows us something, right? Here's another option. Like character X, the artist singing this song seems afraid and fearful, colon, I don't know what to do or where to go. Notice that everything before the colon could in theory be its own sentence, but that would be bad to make it its own sentence, because then the quotation would stand alone as its own sentence. So instead, make it a colon. That way, this is all one sentence. Again, notice we're not talking about how the quote such and such does something. No, we're just showing the reader. Here's another option. The artist sings, "I don't know what to do or where to go," exhibiting a fear similar to character X. So notice again, we're not talking about what the line does. We're talking about the artist or the singer or the narrator or the character. Again, even if a character isn't speaking and you're reading a text, there is some kind of narrator or voice or author to the text. Don't talk about what lines and quotes do. You can quote a full sentence, you can quote several sentences or a passage, or just a specific phrase. I should notice, if you have an extremely long quotation, typically the rule of thumb is if your quotation takes up 4 full lines or more, it should be set off as a block quote. I'm not going to go into detail about that. The Writing Center has a useful page about block quotations here. But here's a couple typical examples. When Charles labels Vasquez as a, quote, fearful wretch, both unloved and unclaimed, he negates any hope of redemption for Vasquez. So notice we're just quoting a little snippet here, a little phrase, a little description. The language is important, and that's why we're quoting it. But we don't need to quote the entire sentence, right? We can be efficient and very selective about what we choose to quote. If all that matters is the phrase, not the whole sentence, then just quote that little bit and integrate it into your sentence. Here's another example. In the poem, Smith's use of the phrase, quote, petulant prods of produce, line 22, is alliterative and references back to the earlier mention of, quote, porous pockets of pox, line 13. Again, all that matters is these little phrases, these little snippets. So that's all we're quoting. So how do you maintain a proper balance between your own words and ideas and outside sources? Again, as always, think about your assignment, about your audience, your goals, your genre, your role, your rhetorical situation. What am I being asked to do here? Am I being asked to present what others have said? Am I being asked to just present my own original ideas, or some combination of both, right? And that's most common, a combination. Perhaps you're being asked to create an original argument, but it's supported by or responding to others. Again, typically you're entering the scholarly discourse. You're responding to some pre-existing context, what other people have said. Remember, outside sources should only offer background information or context, or support or justify your claims or decisions. If you bring in an outside source, finish with your own comment on that source. So here's a common way to do this in a paragraph, is the pie method. You make a point, then you illustrate it, right, by bringing in some outside material, a quotation, a paraphrase, and then you explain it or comment on it. So you should almost never end a paragraph with a quotation, or even with, it depends on the assignment, but maybe even with a paraphrase, probably not, right? Excuse me. If you bring in outside information, right, it should serve to support a point. So you make a claim, you support it or back it up with the actual evidence, the outside information, and then you comment on it or analyze it or explain it. So again, you'll notice that the emphasis is always on your own ideas. In the middle, you've got some outside sources. That's not 100%. Again, it depends on the genre. It depends on your writing style, but this is a general rule of thumb to be mindful of. And again, a paragraph or topic should almost never end with information from an outside source. Almost never. I'm not going to say 100%. But overall, the focus should ultimately be on your own ideas or argument, unless your assignment is just secondary research, right? If all you're being asked to do is compile a bunch of things that other people have said, there are some times when it's like, yeah, none of this is really mine. I'm just bringing in what a bunch of other people have said and compiling it and ordering it in a certain way. Again, when we've talked about this a bit in class, but in terms of citing your sources, always start with a complete bibliographic citation. No matter what citation format, field, discipline, or genre you're working in, pretty much anytime you find a source you think you're gonna need, you know that you're gonna need the author's name, the name of the work, the name of the larger work in which it is existing or published, any kind of publication information. So if there is a publisher, if there is a press, the publication date, the inclusive page numbers. So when does this source start and end? If there's a URL or a DOI. And then eventually figure out, all right, what citation format am I using, and create the full bibliographic citation. The example on the screen here is MLA 8th edition, FYI. But again, you can see we've got the name, we've got the title. It's a chapter in a book. We have the editor, we have the publication information, the year, and the inclusive page numbers. You don't know what your in-text or parenthetical citation looks like until you have your bibliographic citation, because your parenthetical citation is typically going to be based on how your bibliographic citation begins. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Your bibliographic citation. It should contain all of the information necessary to give credit where credit is due and for a reader to actually hunt down that source, right? And again, imagine even if you do give a URL, that URL may end up no longer working in 20 years, but at least the reader has the author's name and the title and enough publication information to where they can look it up and find it on their own. But if you do have a URL, yes, provide it anyway and activate it so people can just click on it and use it. Then you use the bibliographic citation to create your in-text citation. Again, for most, it varies a little bit, but for most citation formats, the in-text citation is going to depend on how the bibliographic citation begins. And that's because the purpose of the in-text citation is to guide the reader to go look in the bibliography to find that matching bibliographic citation. So it makes sense that basically this is telling you, find the citation that starts with blah, right? If this gave like just the title, it would be a lot harder to find this source in a bibliography. So that's the logic there. In-text citations are a shorthand that points the reader to the bibliographic citation at the end of the text. If something is cited in your text, it must appear in your bibliography at the end. Otherwise, the in-text citation leads us nowhere. If something appears in your bibliography at the end of your paper, it needs to be cited somewhere in your text. Otherwise, there's no reason to list it in your bibliography. And again, these are all in MLA format, FYI. A couple quick clarifications. A website does not equal a web page. A website is one page. So a web page is a single page on a larger site. It is kind of similar to a chapter in a book, right? A chapter in a book does not equal the book in which it appears. An episode of a TV show is not the same as the entire TV show. Overall, think about the concept of larger works, which can stand alone, versus smaller works that must exist within the context of larger works, right? A chapter in a book cannot stand alone. A single song cannot stand alone as part of an album. A single episode of a TV show cannot stand alone. A single act or scene in a play cannot stand alone as part of a larger work. Typically, we underline or italicize works that can stand alone. Nowadays, we use italics much more than underlining because with online composition, when we see something underlined, we assume that it's a hyperlink. So for the most part, you'll italicize larger works, and the titles of smaller works, you will put in quotation marks. Either way, it's vital to set off titles from the rest of your writing. Otherwise, it gets confusing. But again, as you're evaluating sources and as you're collecting information, even basic citation information about your source, ask yourself, is this something that can stand alone? What is this genre? Is this a smaller work or a larger work? And finally, we'll talk about a couple of quick kind of do's and don'ts, best practices for research. Get in the habit of conducting thorough research. Don't trust one person's opinion, right? Try to research a topic from all angles. You're not just researching to prove your point. You're researching to get to the truth. So don't just cherry pick your research or your quotations to find something that proves your point. It's very possible and totally valid to do more research and realize, oh, I was wrong. My hypothesis was wrong. That's okay. You learned something, right? And you may end up going back and changing your research question, changing your hypothesis, or just publishing and saying, yeah, I did this experiment. I thought this was going to happen. It didn't, but we learned something, right? That's still valid knowledge and discourse. So you want to conduct thorough research to get to the truth, to understand a topic from all sides. Know a topic well. Take good notes as you research to stay organized. So this refers both to the content of your sources, but also just the citation information, right? When you find a source you think is going to be useful, yes, if it's online or even a journal, sure, bookmark it, but don't just bookmark it, download it. And at the very least, type up some quick notes about all the citation information so you've got it. Even if you don't put it into bibliographic citation format, at least you have all those elements, which will help you find the source again if you lose it, and it'll help you construct the citation once you're ready. Although I would say once you start composing, create your bibliography as soon as possible. And as you're bringing in outside sources, go ahead and have those cited in the text. Do not compose your paper and then go back and insert your citations. That makes no sense. How the hell are you going to know where that quote came from if it does not have some kind of citation or indication or note to yourself at least? So do not wait till the last minute to do your citations. Take good notes as you research, annotate your text, print it out and mark it up, underline things, highlight, circle, draw arrows, make notes in the margins about different topics. Now they connect to other topics. If you're reading digitally, download the document, save it to your device, not to the cloud, but to your device. And you can digitally highlight it, underline it, circle things, insert comments. But so take notes on the material and start taking notes on what this source does. What is this source's topic? What is this source's thesis? What is this source's purpose? What is the genre, the audience, the purpose, the role? Again, if a source seems useful, open the full PDF text of the source. If you don't have full access to the text, it's useless to you. Do not use part. If you can only read the first page of an article, try to get full access. And if you can't, don't use it. It's not going to help. You can't just quote the first page of an article. Open the full text, open the PDF version, which is a facsimile, a scan of what this document looks like in the real world in hard copy with page numbers. That's the one you should download directly to your device and file it away appropriately. You should have a folder on your device specifically for this class. And within that, you should have a folder for each project. And that's what you should, it's vital that you keep these files organized. A lot of these files, when you download them, have weird file names. Rename the file name with the author and the beginning of the title. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting there looking at 12 different PDFs with random file names. You're going to have to open each one just to find it. People waste so much time having to relocate a source they've already found because they don't take the time to be organized. It costs you nothing to download something. It takes 2 seconds to rename it and put it in the proper folder. And that will save you so many headaches in the future. Again, online sources, you might not always have access to it, right? There may be a really useful article. For one thing, at the very least, bookmark it. I've seen many people waste time where it's like they have to continue doing the research process just to get back to that article that they found already, which is so inefficient. But even if it's bookmarked, it could still be taken down. You don't, just because you have access to something on the internet doesn't mean you have indefinite access. It's analogous to your Netflix queue. Just because you put a TV show in your Netflix queue, there's no guarantee that tomorrow that show could get dropped from Netflix and you can't watch it anymore. Just because you have access to an article today doesn't mean that it won't disappear tomorrow. The library could change its subscription policy. The server could go down. There could be a corruption, or just the URL could change. All sorts of things could happen where you no longer have access to it. Also, don't operate under the assumption that you will always 24/7 have easy and fast and reliable access to the internet. You don't own anything until you have it downloaded to your device. And so any important sources you are going to use should be downloaded to your device. So you could compose in the middle of nowhere with no Wi-Fi access if necessary. Again, if you have access to the full text PDF article, use the pagination provided in that article. And that will be almost 100% of all scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles will have a PDF that you can open, you can download. That's the version you should work off of, and use the internal pagination in that PDF. That will make it way easier for you. And it also makes it easy and clear for your reader if they want to find that source themselves and locate that quote that you cited or that paraphrase. Remember to distinguish between online sources and sources that exist on an online database. So for instance, an article in a journal in an online database is not the same as a web page. A lot of people make that mistake. They think, well, I'm on the internet. Yes, but you're looking through an online UNC Libraries database at the online version of a journal, but that journal almost definitely exists somewhere in hard copy, right? So it's not a web page, right? If you just cite it as a web page, you're going to leave out a bunch of important information. And again, they're just two different genres, right? So a typical scholarly article is something that exists in the real world in hard copy. You could go into the library, find it, pull it off the shelf, and you would cite it like that, right? It just happens to have been scanned and digitized, and the digital version has been made available to you through an online database. Cite correctly and completely. Again, citation builders are often out of date, unreliable. The creators aren't necessarily reliable. These citations change with new additions and they're not always up to date. And also they're only as good as you are. So if you tell the citation builder to that you're citing a website when you're actually citing an online journal, it's going to format it incorrectly for you. If you type something into one of the elements and you have a spelling error, citation builder isn't going to correct that for you. And I've tested a lot of the algorithms where everything should work normal, but still the algorithm misinterprets the text and spits out incorrect information. Also, if you put the wrong element in the wrong blank, right? So it's subject to human error. I personally don't see the value in them at all, because if you ever use a citation builder, you still have to go back and double check the results, or else it's going to be incorrect. Almost 100% of the time, I can immediately look at a citation from a student and say, it's wrong. And I know why, because you used a citation builder and you didn't double check. To me, it just seems easier to use the citation guidelines I provided you on Sakai, and I've provided you links to the citation guidelines from the Writing Center and the UNC libraries. Use those and just carefully construct your citations. And again, the key here is not memorizing conventions, but learning to navigate different conventions of different fields, disciplines, genres, and different citation formats. We're going to cover several in this class, but this will empower you in the future when you are exposed to some new thing, some new discipline or citation format, that you'll have practice and you'll know the basic best practices and the do's and don'ts for how to navigate and learn and adjust to that new situation. And finally, a couple more resources: the UNC Library's Guide to Citations and the UNC Writing Center's page on quotations, paraphrasing, and plagiarism. Thanks for watching, everyone. This video is a little bit longer than I planned, but hopefully this was a helpful supplement to the discussions we've had. And I think this was more useful than just giving you this PowerPoint to go through on your own. Again, the slides themselves are available on Sakai at resources as well. If you have any questions, as always, you can feel free to email me, see me before or after class, or visit my office hours. Thanks for watching. Take care.